Okay, so I did a dumb thing. I got involved in a Twitter argument. I know. It is a Twitter argument that you may or may not have come across, but it is one that is particularly incendiary to me. I felt the inescapable compulsion to make a video. You might have heard of this debate, you might not have, but I'm going to say what the debate is, what the arguments are in the debate, and why I think this kind of matters. The debate is whether 2 plus 2 must equal 4. Because it's 2021, and this is what we must discuss. In many ways, I find this a relatively innocuous microcosm. It is a relatively safe way to talk about some of the many epistemological horrors that are ravaging society. I have an inkling about where this debate started. I don't know the exact specifics, but I suspect it was something, someone somewhere, some academic or something made some point that knowledge is fluid and there's no objectivity, and our own biases and closed-mindedness, what have you, blind us to certain truths, which is of course the case. But somehow math got involved. Just side note, if there's ever been anything as multicultural as mathematics, I don't know what it is. Advancements in mathematics have come from people of every color, race, creed, nationality, what have you. Algebra is literally Arabic. Al-Jabr means the reunion of broken parts, or bone setting, incidentally. Various cultures were doing mathematics. They discovered it seemingly independently. Yeah, they had different ways to label and demonstrate the mathematics, which we'll talk about labels a lot here. But ultimately, the math they were doing was the same across cultures, across time. And so someone pointed out, like there is some objectivity, math is objective, 2 plus 2 equals 4, what have you. And some people, either well-intentioned or not, I don't know, said, not so fast, maybe not. 2 plus 2 doesn't have to equal 4. Again, if you haven't come across this argument, you might be thinking, is this really how we're going to spend our time? Yes, it is, apparently. First, let's lay out what we mean when we say 2 plus 2 equals 4. Quite simply, 2 plus 2 equals 4 means if I have 2 items and 2 more items and I count them all up, I have 4 items. Now, the philosophical construct of an item is true, a metaphysical cluster muck. The concept of this pen, right? This one pen. Well, what is one pen? When does it stop being a pen? If I remove the tip and the cap and the ink thing, is this still a pen? Grant me the premise of one thing for now, and we can discuss the mathematics of using one thing. If one thing did exist, if there is such a thing as one thing, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 would be 4 things. That is the logic that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is representing. Now, this pen exists physically. I can hold it. But I want you, as much as you can, to treat the logical fact of 2 plus 2 equals 4 as if it were as physical as a pen. Because in the same way that the letters P-E-N are a representation for this object, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a representation of that logical thought. So, why would someone say 2 plus 2 does not equal 4? Okay, few ways. The first is to say something like, well, if I have 2 apples and 2 apples, and I cut one of the apples in half, I now have 5 things, so maybe 2 plus 2 equals 5. Okay, first of all, this spins math into uselessness, because we can cut the apple into borderline infinitely smaller pieces and say 2 plus 2 is whatever the hell we want. This seems to me like the logic of a cheesy basketball coach of 10-year-olds. Well, we got 5 guys, 1 guy, 2 guy, 3 guy, 4 guy, 5 guys, so what is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1? and they say 5, and the coach says no, 1, 1 team. Splitting an apple in half doesn't change the sum of apples. It changes the number of items you're counting. You have 1 apple, 1 apple, 1 apple, 1 half an apple, 1 half an apple, so there's 5 pieces. But when you count those 5 pieces, you're not doing addition, you are counting what is called the cardinality of a set, which is not the same thing as the sum of the numbers in the set. It's a different thing that does not show that 2 plus 2 sometimes doesn't equal 4. The other argument I've seen is like, well, what if it's, one rooster and one hen get together and they copulate and they have a little baby chick. Now 1 plus 1 is 3. The symbol plus is not a symbol for gets together, copulates, and has an offspring with. The symbol plus is a function of counting. If the chick comes into the picture, that's another unit to count. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. If you want to make an operation that stands for copulates and has an offspring, you can make that symbol. I'm just going to choose one randomly. There you go. 1 plus 1, when they copulate and have an offspring, equals 3. But that's not addition. You're doing something else. You are not changing the fact that 2 plus 2 is 4 or that 1 plus 1 is 2. Then there are the two more sophisticated arguments, in my opinion, because they do involve some knowledge of higher and more abstract mathematics. The first is to say something like, well, in base 4, 2 plus 2 equals 10. We're going to come back to that in a second. What I'm going to say first is, what if I told you this writing utensil in Mexico is a bolígrafo? Does that change the fact that this is a pen? No, of course not. A pen is a bolígrafo. It's just different words for the same thing, same idea, the same object. When someone says 2 plus 2 equals 10 in base 4, we don't need to talk about what base 4 is. You can look that up on your own. It just means 2 plus 2 is 4, but the labeling is different. 10 in base 4 is what we think of as 4. It's just another symbol for the same logic. It's just wallpaper. It's a different appearance of the same math at the base. When someone has this argument, the argument they are having, without maybe knowing that they're having it, is as if I'm saying this object has to be called a pen, and any other labeling of this object is wrong. That's not the discussion. In the language of English, this object is a pen, that's what pen stands for. The fact that somewhere else there's a different way to represent this object does not change the fact that this is a pen. And to point out that other people call it something else is banal and obvious. Of course they do. It doesn't change the fact that this is a pen. The last argument talks about other branches of mathematics where 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. The most common example would be modular arithmetic. So someone might say, in modulo 3, 2 plus 2 equals 1. In modulus 4, 2 plus 2 equals 0. These are true. The problem is that we're not doing the same thing in these mathematics. The symbols don't mean the same thing. 2 plus 2 equals 1 in modulo 3 means when we add 2 and 2 together, the remainder is 1 when we divide that sum by 3. We are no longer counting up items. It's not the same logic. It borrows similar symbols, but it's not the same logic. To bring back a pen analogy, if I say, this writing utensil is a pen, and someone says, is it a pen? It doesn't look like a fenced enclosure for livestock. P-E-N, that word can mean a fenced enclosure for livestock, and so is this really a pen? All you're pointing out is that the same symbols can mean different things in different contexts. You are not attacking the logic itself. All you are doing is making the superficial point that we use similar symbols to represent different ideas or objects. It is not interesting. It is not insightful. It is not worth the time of the discussion. And here's the issue. When people do this, they are using the symbols 2 plus 2 equals 4 and attacking those symbols or tweaking those symbols as if they are attacking the logic that 2 plus 2 equals 4. These symbols, again, are a little bit arbitrary. They just happen to be the symbols that we use to represent this thought. But the symbols themselves are not the thought. And by showing that, hey, sometimes we have different symbols for the thought, or that, hey, sometimes the same symbols represent different thoughts, does not have any bearing on the logic that we are discussing. And so we have one group who wants to talk about the logic of 2 plus 2 equals 4, and this other group that acts like they want to talk about that logic, but are really just talking about descriptions and labels. And somehow this seems relevant. When this other group says there are times where 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, what they mean, maybe without knowing that they mean it, is 2 plus 2, the symbol, can represent a different thought, or there are different ways to represent 4. Neither of these discredit the idea that counting 2 things and counting 2 things counts to 4 things. All it is appearance. But it's treated as if it's logic. We're no longer talking about ideas. We're talking about representation of ideas, as if we're talking about ideas. We're not discussing a pen. We're discussing the letters P-E-N. So why does this matter? Aren't these just sophists? Yeah, but we are living through an epistemological crisis. And there are forces, many of them ill-intentioned, that are trying to get us to question and argue over the most basic trivialities. And sometimes well-intentioned people are swayed by these arguments and promulgate them, not meaning to do any harm, but further spinning society into confusion. So when you encounter this particular argument, you can share this video. For all the other arguments where people are using similar tactics such as these in usually harder to discern ways over more subtle truths than 2 plus 2 equals 4, we have some figuring out to do.